April 18th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean, east of Japan. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stood on the deck of the USS Hornet and looked at his B-25 Mitchell bomber. Behind it, 15 more bombers were crammed onto the carrier's deck, wingtip to wingtip. These planes were too big for carrier operations. They could take off, but they could never land. This was a one-way mission. 4 months earlier, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor and destroyed much of America's Pacific Fleet. Since then, Japan had swept across the Pacific almost unopposed. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. America was losing badly. The country needed something, anything to show that America could fight back. Jimmy Doolittle had a plan so bold that it just might work. Bomb Tokyo. Then fly west to China and hope for the best. Jimmy Doolittle wasn't a typical Army officer. Born in 1896, he'd become one of America's most famous pilots in the 1920s and 30s. He won air races. He set speed records. In 1922, he became the first pilot to fly across the United States in less than 24 hours. In 1929, he became the first pilot to fly using only instruments, without looking outside. He had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. When the Army needed someone to do the impossible, they called Doolittle. In January 1942, the Army asked Doolittle if it was possible to launch a bomber from an aircraft carrier. He said yes, but it would be extremely dangerous. They asked if he wanted to lead the mission. He said yes immediately. For the next 3 months, Doolittle and his team prepared for something that had never been done before. They modified 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. They stripped out everything unnecessary to save weight. They removed the lower gun turrets. They installed extra fuel tanks to extend the plane's range. A normal B-25 needed 1,000 feet of runway to take off. They trained until the pilots could do it in 450 feet, roughly the length of a carrier deck. They selected 80 men, all volunteers, 16 pilots, 16 co-pilots, 16 navigators, 16 bombardiers, and 16 gunners. Most were in their 20s. The youngest was 21. The oldest was Doolittle himself at 45. None of them knew where they were going when they boarded the USS Hornet in San Francisco on April 2nd, 1942. They learned the target only after the ship was at sea. Tokyo. The plan was straightforward. USS Hornet would sail to within 400 miles of Japan. The B-25s would launch, bomb Tokyo, then continue west to China where they'd land at Allied airfields. The Chinese were expecting them. Everything was coordinated, except nothing went according to plan. On the morning of April 18th, USS Hornet was still 650 miles from Japan when it encountered a Japanese patrol boat. The boat's crew spotted the American ships and radioed a warning before the Americans could sink it. Japan now knew American carriers were approaching. If USS Hornet continued closer, Japanese planes would attack the carrier before Doolittle's bombers could launch. Admiral William Halsey commanded the carrier task force. He had to make a decision fast. Launch now from 650 miles away or abort the mission entirely. Launching from 650 miles meant the bombers wouldn't have enough fuel to reach the Chinese airfields. The crews would have to bail out or crash land somewhere in China and hope they survived. Halsey ordered the launch. It was 8:20 a.m. Doolittle climbed into his bomber and started the engines. The carrier's deck officer gave the signal. Doolittle pushed the throttles forward and his B-25 roared down the short deck. He had 450 feet. At the end of the deck, his bomber dropped toward the ocean, then climbed. Behind him, 15 more bombers followed. All 16 made it into the air. They formed up and headed west toward Japan. The bombers flew low over the Pacific to avoid radar detection. At 12:15 p.m., They reached the Japanese coast. There was no resistance. Japanese fighters had been pulled back to defend against the expected carrier attack. The bombers continued inland toward Tokyo. At 12:30 p.m., air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. People looked up and saw American bombers overhead. It was impossible. Tokyo was 1,200 miles from the nearest American base. How did these planes get here? But there they were, and bombs were falling. The 16 planes split up and attacked targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. They bombed military installations, factories, oil refineries, and shipyards. The actual physical damage was minimal. About 50 people were killed. Some buildings were destroyed. But the psychological impact was enormous. For months, the Japanese military had promised the people that the homeland was safe, that American forces were too weak and too far away to threaten Japan. That promise was now shattered. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, nowhere in Japan was safe. The myth of Japanese invulnerability died that afternoon. After dropping their bombs, the 16 planes turned west toward China. They were already critically low on fuel. The early launch had used up their safety margin. As they flew over the East China Sea, fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Darkness fell. Weather turned bad. Rain and fog reduced visibility to nearly zero. The Chinese airfields were supposed to have their runway lights on as a guide, but the airfields were dark. The message about the early launch hadn't reached them. Or maybe it had, and they didn't want to risk Japanese retaliation by lighting up their runways. Either way, the bombers were running out of fuel in the dark with no place to land. One by one, the planes ran out of fuel. Some pilots attempted crash landings along the Chinese coast. Others flew as far inland as possible and ordered their crews to bail out. Doolittle himself bailed out over China around 9 p.m. He parachuted into a rice paddy in complete darkness. He had no idea where he was. He didn't know if he was in Chinese territory or Japanese-occupied territory. He didn't know if any of his men had survived. All 16 planes were lost. Not a single one reached the Chinese airfields. But of the 80 crew members, most survived the bailouts and crash landings. Chinese civilians and soldiers helped them hide and escape. Farmers gave them food and shelter. Resistance fighters guided them through Japanese lines. It took weeks, but 69 of the 80 raiders eventually made it to safety. 3 men died in crash landings. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in China. The Japanese imprisoned them and charged them as war criminals for bombing civilians. All 8 were tried in a military court. All 8 were sentenced to death. Then the sentence was commuted for 5 of them to life in prison. 3 were executed by firing squad. Of the 5 imprisoned, 1 died of starvation. 4 survived until liberation in August 1945. Back in America, the raid was headline news. After 4 months of defeats, America had finally struck back. The exact location of the raid was kept secret. President Roosevelt told reporters the bombers had launched from Shangri-La, a fictional paradise from a popular novel. The American public didn't care where the bombers came from. They only cared that Tokyo had been bombed. Jimmy Doolittle was promoted to Brigadier General and awarded the Medal of Honor. He expected to be court-martialed for losing all 16 planes and getting men killed and captured. Instead, he became a national hero. For the rest of the war, Doolittle commanded air forces in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. He retired as a lieutenant general in 1946, but the raid's impact went far beyond American morale. Japan's military leadership was humiliated. They'd promised the emperor that the homeland was safe. They'd been proven wrong. The raid forced Japan to recall fighter squadrons from the Pacific to defend Japan. It forced them to divert resources to homeland defense instead of offensive operations. Most importantly, it influenced Japanese strategy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, decided that the American carriers had to be destroyed immediately. He planned an attack on Midway Island designed to lure the American carriers into a trap. That plan resulted in the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and the best of its naval pilots. Japan never recovered from Midway. The Doolittle Raid led directly to that decisive American victory. The Chinese people paid a terrible price for helping the American airmen. When Japan learned that Chinese civilians had sheltered Doolittle's men, they launched a revenge campaign. Japanese forces swept through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. They destroyed every airfield that could have been used by American planes. They killed anyone suspected of helping the Americans. Entire villages were burned. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in retaliation. Doolittle carried that guilt for the rest of his life. He felt responsible for those deaths. But when he met Chinese survivors after the war, they told him the same thing. They would do it again. The raid had shown that Japan could be defeated. That was worth the sacrifice. The Doolittle Raiders became a brotherhood. They held annual reunions for decades. In 1959, the city of Tucson gave them a special gift: 80 silver goblets, one for each raider engraved with their names. At every reunion, they performed a roll call. When a raider's name was called and he was present, he would stand. When a raider had died since the last reunion, another raider would turn his goblet upside down in a toast. The upside-down goblet was filled with cognac from a bottle that traveled to every reunion. Year by year, more goblets were turned upside down. By 2013, only 4 raiders were still alive. They held their final public reunion that year in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. The last surviving raider, Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole, died in April 2019 at age 103. He had been Doolittle's co-pilot on the lead plane. His goblet was the last to be turned upside down. The raid itself lasted about 5 hours from takeoff to bailout, but it changed the Pacific War. Tactically, it was a failure. All planes lost. Minimal damage to Japan. 3 men dead, 8 captured, 1 died in captivity. But strategically, it was a triumph. It proved Japan was vulnerable. It boosted American morale at the darkest moment of the war. It forced Japan to divert resources to homeland defense. And it led directly to Japan's disastrous defeat at Midway. 80 young men climbed into bombers knowing they'd never land them. They bombed the enemy capital and jumped into the night over hostile territory. Most survived. Some didn't. None of them regretted it. When asked years later if he would do it again, Jimmy Doolittle said yes without hesitation. Sometimes the mission everyone says is impossible is the only one worth flying.